You're listening to the Journey Podcast. What if reshaping your mind could genuinely transform your reality and well-being? Discover more in this episode. This episode contains adult subject matter, and some listeners may be triggered by this content. Listener discretion is advised. Hi, I'm Petra Brunbauer, and with decades of experience with sadness, pain, anxiety, and stress, I finally figured out how to leave all that behind. And this podcast shows you how to break free permanently so you can reclaim your sanity and find the self-esteem and energy to go after the life you desire. With real talk about mental health, holistic healing, and the tough journey of coming out the other end. This is the Journey Podcast. Welcome to today's episode. In this episode, we explore the fascinating realm of neuroplasticity and its profound implications for mental health and personal growth. Through a deeply personal narrative, our guest shares her transformative journey of grappling with learning disabilities that once cast a shadow over her life. However, her story takes a remarkable turn as she discovers the incredible power of neuroplasticity, the brain's remarkable ability to rewire and adapt itself. An innovator and author in the field of neuroeducation, Barbara Arrowsmith Young's work utilizing the principles of neuroplasticity is used worldwide to enhance cognitive functioning. Her vision is to put the brain in the education equation. Her work began in 1978 and is recognized as one of the first examples of the practical application of neuroplasticity to address learning difficulties, and its application has expanded to address those dealing with traumatic brain injury, addiction, cognitive decline with aging, and those who want to enhance performance. Her journey and work is documented in her best-selling book, The Woman Who Changed Her Brain, and in her TEDx talk. As the director of the Arrowsmith program, Barbara continues to engage in research to understand how we can drive neuroplastic change in the brain to benefit learners of all ages. Let's meet Barbara Arrowsmith Young. Hi, Barbara. It's so great to have you on the podcast today. I've been looking forward to getting to chat with you because neuroplasticity and mental health is such an interesting topic for holistic healing. So welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. I'm really thrilled to be here.
Yeah, it's my pleasure. It's a topic we have not much spoken about before, so I'm very interested to find out more. For starters, do you want to share a little bit about yourself and your story and how you came to do what you do today?
Sure. Well, I kind of joke that my story began at birth in terms of, leading me on the path that informed the work that I created in the world. Really, I was born in the early 1950s, so a time when we didn't even think about neuroplasticity. It really wasn't in the lexicon, and the belief was there really wasn't human neuroplasticity. And I had very significant learning difficulties. And even when I started school in grade 1, I was identified as being slow. I was identified as being a turtle because they didn't even have a concept of having a learning disability. But it was very clear as soon as I started school that I did not learn the way other children in the classroom did. I wrote everything backwards. I read backwards. You'd give me 4 numbers to add, and I'd add them in a random sequence. I didn't understand social interactions. I didn't understand what the teacher was asking me to do. I was pretty miserable, and actually my teacher was pretty miserable as well because she hadn't encountered a child like me. And I remember overhearing her talk to my mother and say to my mother not to have high expectations for her daughter. I feel like I was given a life sentence in grade 1, that the expectation was that schooling was always going to be a struggle, which actually that was true. I can't think about school. It was not a joyful, happy experience. It was a struggle because of the learning difficulties, but not to have expectations that I would go on in education because of my difficulties. And there was also a belief that I was being willful, that if I only tried harder, I could do these things. And that's where some of the mental health issues come in, because I started to develop a self-concept that I was not a good person, that I was not intelligent, that I was difficult. And it was just really the way my brain was wired. My mother was an educator, so she was determined that her daughter was going to learn how to read. So I would come home at lunch, have flashcards with letters and numbers. I'd come home after school. So I joke that I became a workaholic in grade one. I wasn't really appreciative at the time, but I'm very appreciative now because I did learn how to read. I did learn how to write. I did learn how to do basic arithmetic. However, it didn't address the underlying learning difficulty, right? It treated the symptoms, not the cause, the root cause of the difficulty. I could now perform certain tasks, but I still significantly struggled. It was almost as if the translator in my brain was broken. I describe it in that way. I could listen to language, I could listen to conversations, I could listen to instructions, I could recognize the words, but it was really hard for me to understand the concept or the meaning behind the word. So, what was the person really asking me to do? What was that question asking me to do? I did have a really strong auditory memory and a strong visual memory. So, really, I got through a lot of my schooling by memorizing my textbooks. When I'd get the exam, I'd try to flip through in my mind the pages of my textbooks, match it to the question, and write down the answer without really understanding the question. And sometimes I get 100% because I did a really good match. And sometimes I get 0% because I did a really poor match. So again, it was confusing to the teachers because they'd say, wow, she did 100 over here. She got 0 over here. She must not have been trying. So really had a huge impact on my self-concept. I ended up struggling with depression, anxiety, a lot of performance anxiety. I would actually be intimidated by conversations. So I could really only have one friend at a time because if there were multiple people talking, I would just get lost. So I spent a lot of time smiling and not saying anything because I figured, or nodding my head, or when somebody said a joke, I would look at other people laughing and I would match my laughter to their laughter because I didn't understand jokes. I didn't understand irony, all those kind of nuanced meanings in language escaped me. And then I also had difficulties, what I call kinesthetic. I didn't know where my body was in space. I had a spatial difficulty. I would get lost all the time playing sports. I was always the last child chosen for a sports team. And I understand why, because I was no asset to any athletic endeavor. Because if a ball was coming at me, my first reaction was to run as quickly as I could in the opposite direction because I couldn't judge where I was, where the ball was. And often the ball would connect with some aspect of my body. So I'd have bruises. I didn't excel athletically. I struggled academically and I struggled socially. There was an area where I felt like I could really succeed. My parents, I know they cared about me very much. They wanted the best for me. But every day I went into that classroom and that was my experience. So, you think about post-traumatic stress disorder, like schooling for me led to traumatic stress because I would struggle to try to understand, to fit in, to do what I was being asked to do. But with the best will in the world, I couldn't do it, or I could do it maybe 10% of what was being asked of me. I mentioned it led to certainly depression. And at age 13, I was finishing grade 8, which in our academic world, you now go into high school. And I thought, oh my gosh, like it was such a struggle to cope with elementary school. How was I going to manage with high school with different subjects, different teachers, finding my locker? Like that was scary because I get lost all the time, remembering the combination of my locker. Sadly, I decided to attempt to end my life. And one of the mixed blessings of having the learning difficulty I had is I didn't really understand how one went about doing that. So I did what I thought would work, and clearly it didn't because I'm still here and I'm actually really grateful that it didn't. But it speaks to the despair that I felt, that I just couldn't imagine how I could continue. So that was my trajectory. And then when I decided to go to university, I thought, I want to study child development because I want to understand what's wrong with me. If I can understand what goes on in child development, maybe I can get some insight. And then I went to do my master's in school psychology again. So that's why I say, sort of from birth, I was on this quest. And my father was a scientist and an inventor. And he said to me, very early on, he said, if there's a problem in the world and no solution, he said, it's your responsibility to go out and find a solution. And he said, if the rest of the world tells you you can't do it, he said, don't listen to conventional wisdom. He said, this is how science goes forward. And I felt like I was on this quest, had no idea how I was going to do it, if I could do it. But that was always there in the back of my head. So when I was doing my master's in school psychology, I came across a book called The Man with the Shattered World. And it was a Russian neuropsychologist, Alexander Luria, who wrote this book. And it was telling the story of a Russian soldier who in World War II had a very localized head wound. So it was this man, Lyova Zazetsky, who was writing his journal of all of his struggles. And then Luria was explaining what was going on in this man's brain. And as I read Zazetsky's journal, and I looked at my journal because I was keeping a journal, this was in Canada, I thought, we're describing the same problems. I mean, I knew I didn't have shrapnel in my brain, but now I knew there was something in my brain that wasn't working, because to solve a problem, you have to understand its nature. Now I knew something is not working, there's something wrong with the wiring, because we were describing exactly the same problems. And then I thought, well, what do I do about it? It's great. Now I understand it, but what do I do about it? And at the same time, I was reading Mark Rosenzweig's research coming out of Berkeley. And he was looking at neuroplasticity in rats. And you give rats lots of stimulation, toys to play with, and they become better at learning mazes, which is like a little rat intelligence test. And then when he looked at their brains had changed physiologically. So he argued stimulation can lead to physiological changes in the brain, which then leads to better learning. So I thought, if rats can do it, surely humans can do it. And I went to all my professors, because I was studying at the University of Toronto at that time, and said, I'm really excited. I know what my problems are. And I think I've got something that I can do to address them. And they all looked at me and said, well, first of all, learning disabilities have nothing to do with the brain. I mean, this was in 1977. Now we know they do. And then they said, and even if they did, there isn't neuroplasticity in humans. Again, that light bulb went off. I remembered what my father had said: don't listen, go out and try. So I started going into Luri's work, reading, trying to understand the nature of the problem, and created 3 different programs for myself, because I had 3 really very significant areas: the spatial, the kinesthetic, and then the reasoning problem. As I worked through them, and I worked really hard, things changed in my world. I could now do things with ease, which were before, with the best will in the world and effort, I couldn't do them. To me, I was living proof of human neuroplasticity. And then I thought, okay, I've benefited. I need to take this work out into the world and help others. So that was in 1978. I started a learning center in Toronto in 1980, opened a school, started going out into other schools, training teachers. And now we're in multiple countries, in multiple organizations. And my goal is to take this work and support individuals that are struggling with learning to transform their lives. And certainly in terms of mental health for me, as I had all these cognitive changes, I can now access therapy, because the nature of my problem, I couldn't make connections, like cause and effect. If you can't make connections, you don't have insight. And you can't benefit from therapy because you don't understand what the therapist is asking of you, or you don't understand even your own experience. It was like that booming, buzzing confusion. Now, every night as I would go to sleep, I would think about events in my life starting at age 4 and 5 and 6. All of a sudden, it was like that light bulb went off. Oh my gosh, this is why that happened. This is what that meant. And it feels like those fragmented parts of my psyche started to integrate into a whole integrated human being. It was profound. So neuroplasticity has lots to offer mental health, because it is our brain that allows us to understand ourselves, to understand other people, to understand our world and our relationship to that world. And if there's any barrier or limitation, it will have an impact on mental health. And I've sort of rambled on quite a bit, so I'll stop here, but I've got lots to say about that. I saw the transformation of my life, and I wanted to give this to the world.
Yeah. Wow. Thank you so much for sharing your journey so far. And you have certainly experienced a lot. And it does make me think about how many other children are experiencing what you went through, how many other children are having mental health challenges because of this, and nobody's recognizing it, or there isn't the help available that they need. And adults also, right? How many people are struggling with this, and there could be something to help them out there. So wonderful that you are starting these programs, that you are putting them out in the world. I think this is so helpful to so many people. And can we just take one step back and let's talk about what neuroplasticity really is. So for some of the listeners who might not be familiar with that, let's give them an insight into what neuroplasticity is and what that means and how that could help them on the journey of learning disabilities or any mental health challenges that they might be looking at. How can neuroplasticity be involved in all that?
Absolutely. So really, at a very simple level, neuroplasticity means our brain is changeable. When I started schooling, as I said, the belief was your brain was fixed. Basically, the brain you're born with is the brain that you die with. And if there's a difficulty, live with it. And what we know now, that's not the case, that our brain reorganizes itself, rewires itself. We know that we can grow connections, like dendrites in the brain on the neurons, which increase synaptic connections, increase neurotransmitters. We can actually even grow new neurons, which I think that research didn't come out until sometime in the 80s. So our brain is incredibly adaptable and changeable, which makes sense because it's the organ that allows us to adapt to the world and understand our world. Our brain is changing all the time. Now, the kind of change I'm talking about is really very specific change to different parts of the brain. And there's this concept of targeted differential stimulation. So, what that just means is if I want to get better in being able to reason, which is the area that I had trouble, I have to understand what's not working there. And I have to find an activity to make that part of the brain work without the support of the other parts of the brain. And over time, it's sort of just like physical exercise. You start at a low weight with 5 reps, and then you get up to 10 reps, and then 15, and then you increase the difficulty by increasing the amount of weight that you're lifting. The brain is very similar. It wants stress, like enough effort, I guess is a better word than stress. So if something is really easy that you're doing, it can be fun, but it's probably not going to drive neuroplastic change in the brain. So it's kind of finding that sweet spot of picking an activity that is just slightly above your current level of functioning with ease, and then engage at that level. And then when it becomes easy, make it a little harder. That's what I say to people. If you want to add a neuroplastic effort into daily activities, calibrate the level of difficulty, start at just above where you're currently holding, and then as you master that, gradually increase. And that we talk a lot about brain health. I mean, that will keep your brain healthy and active, and you can do it in any of your activities. And the other thing is that if you really want to drive change in your brain, you can't do it for 2 minutes a day, right? It would be nice if you could. So it's like, again, aerobic exercise, kind of the rule of thumb is maybe about 20 minutes. You need to get in there, sustain the activity to get some significant change. But back to this idea of neuroplasticity, I mean, to me, what's so promising is if we can understand it and we can harness it, things that we thought you had to live with for your life, we don't. I mean, a lot of the work that's being done with post-traumatic stress disorder is using neuroplasticity, like it's rewiring the brain not to respond sort of automatically to those triggers. It's rechanging the wiring. So neuroplasticity can be positive, like changing things in a positive direction, but neuroplasticity also can be negative, where we can create wiring like in post-traumatic stress disorder or an addiction that isn't healthy for the brain. What we need to do is look at what are those things that are healthy versus not healthy and focus on those. I mean, that's what's really, really critical and important. I mean, we know that getting a good amount of sleep is important. We know that physical exercise is important. I mean, these are things all of us can add into our lives. We know that reasonably healthy diet. We know that social relationships are important to keep our brain healthy. We've done a study in Queensland and Toowoomba in Australia with a group. It's in Teen Challenge. So it's a group of young adults, males and females, that have addiction, right? And we know addiction rewires the brain in a certain way. And what we're seeing as they're going through this is the program is changing that wiring and giving them cognitive abilities to then make different choices and also benefit from therapy. So I think in my lifetime, one of the most positive developments is our understanding that neuroplasticity exists and starting to learn ways we can apply it. I mean, there's lots of research, neuroplasticity and pain. I suffer from a condition that I've had pain pretty much every day for 30 years. The condition is not going to go away, but I've used neuroplastic techniques to manage to function on a daily basis and reduce the pain. And I think it also gives us agency in our lives, which is important to mental health, that we don't have to, as I said, like accept other people's definitions or limitations. So I think it's really incredibly encouraging.
Hmm. Yeah, especially also what you just mentioned about pain. I think pain and stress were sort of two very, very prominent things that are cropping up, especially in the last few years for people who are suffering. And the neuroplasticity, especially in pain reprocessing therapy and things like that, I think has great application also. So, such a variety of things that could be applied to really help people lead a much better quality of life, as you said. And sometimes we can't change, like your pain condition, you can't change that, but we can change how that affects us on a daily level and in our daily lives. What a fantastic research, fantastic insight. And thank you so much for sharing that. Now, how can listeners imagine working with neuroplasticity? Are these exercises that you have to visualize or you physically have to do something? Or how can people work with their brains to keep them sharp? What kind of things do they have to do?
One thing that's accessible to almost anybody is mindfulness. And they're all different kinds of techniques. So it's really finding the technique that works best for each individual. And there's lots of free resources on the internet. So I would encourage anybody that doesn't have a mindful practice to do that. I saw some research, which to me was fascinating. People that have done a lot of mindfulness versus people that haven't. And you put them in a situation with physical pain, and they were wired up with looking at the brains. And the person that hadn't done the mindfulness, the pain kind of took over and dominated in terms of what was going on in the brain. Whereas the person that had done meditation, it showed up briefly, and then the brain calmed down and went away. And mindfulness with post-traumatic stress disorder, anxiety, depression, again, with pain, I think it's really valuable for people to have a mindfulness practice. And it doesn't have to be something you do 60 minutes a day. Even you find yourself in a stressful situation, just do a quick breathing technique. Like anything that reduces stress is neuroprotective for the brain. I mean, it really is. Like one researcher said, stress is like an acid bath for your brain. So kind of imagine, I mean, it's a little extreme, and it's not momentary stress, it's that chronic long-term stress. So anything one can do in their life to reduce that might be going out for a nice walk for 15, 20 minutes at lunchtime and kind of doing some breathing exercises as you walk. Like there are things that we can incorporate that are easy, that are free into our life. People that have trouble sleeping, again, you can use a mindfulness exercise before you go to sleep. Again, there's research looking at people that do meditation or mindfulness activities. And as we age, there's a thing called cortical thinning, right? I mean, we lose some of those connections. And they compared people that did have a mindfulness practice with people that didn't. And there's less cortical thinning in people that have a mindfulness practice. So again, we hear a lot about keeping our brain healthy as we age. That's probably the simplest thing that anybody has access to. And then putting those principles that I talked about, they're called effortful processing, is the one where you find the level of effort that's just a little bit beyond where you currently are and engage at that level and then increase the stimulation. That comes out of neuroscience labs. Active sustained engagement. So keep your attention on the activity and sustain the engagement, say 20 minutes a day, maybe 4 or 5 days a week. And pick something that you want to engage in, because that's probably going to keep you more engaged, like maybe something you want to learn. I mean, those are things that don't cost anything and we can all do in our lives. And then if somebody has an area of learning difficulty, that's where my work comes in, because it's very, very specific. We have programs for 19 different cognitive functions, and each one is very specific because it has to target that region or network in the brain. We have research showing the networks that are changing in the brain as they go through our program, the cognitive areas that are changing, the learning that changes, actually social and emotional well-being. One of the studies we did, we looked at cortisol. The students got to spit, which they really liked at the beginning of the study and the end of the study, because they measured cortisol, and there was a reduction of cortisol, which, the stress hormone, which was really positive. I mean, there was cognitive changes, brain changes, and, stress reduction. I think these are all things, but if there's a learning difficulty, I would argue they need this kind of targeted approach. And we've developed programs. I mean, COVID was a great disruptor in our work because we were in physical schools and all of a sudden those doors closed. So we had to develop online programs. So now we have online programs so students all around the world can access our work. And we work with people age 5 up to 95. And we have research with people with acquired brain injury. Basically, if you've got a brain, you can stimulate it and improve it and enhance it, whether it's something you want to do in your own life or it's more significant and you need to get support to do that. But one of the things I'd say, if any parents listening and have a child struggling with a learning difficulty, is don't give up. Keep hunting because there are solutions out there. And you don't need to live like there's still the definition of a learning disability, certainly in North America, that it's a lifelong condition. That's not the case, especially with neuroplasticity, that it doesn't have to be a lifelong condition. So I'm not sure if I answered your question, but yeah.
Yeah, it was fantastic. And I do like that we know more about this now and we don't condemn people to have to live a certain life or to miss out on things just because they need a bit of extra support. So wonderful work that you're doing. And if our listeners are inspired by this episode and they're wondering how they can work with you or how you put your programs and services out there, do you want to talk a little bit about what you offer, what's available, and how they can find those things?
Yeah. So the first place to start is probably with our website. We've just done a total rewrite. So it's arrowsmith.ca. Arrowsmith is my middle name, and it was named after my pioneering grandmother. I feel I'm a pioneer in this work. So arrowsmith.ca. And we have a wealth of resources. There's a cognitive questionnaire. It's free. You can fill it out for either yourself or your child. And at the end of it, it will give you a snapshot of your cognitive profile and give you insight into maybe why some things are easy for you and why some things might be difficult. So it absolutely is a great place to start. We've got webinars that are free, like on this incredible asset that we have, which is our brain. So we have all sorts of webinars. They're online that you can dial into and get more insight into how our brain operates, how it shapes our behavior, looking at behavior through a cognitive lens, because our cognitive makeup drives our behavior. There's all sorts of research, like we've done a lot of different research studies for the people that really like to read research. There are 2 free downloadable books on our website. There's The Brain Pioneer, which was written by Howard Eaton, a person on the west coast of Canada that got fascinated by this work and offers it in his school. And it's really accessible book. It was written more for kind of teenagers, but a lot of adults really like it as well, that talks about this work. He also wrote a book called The Brain School, the application of this work in schools. So those he's kindly offered as free downloads. So you can go on the website and get them. There's my book, The Woman Who Changed Her Brain, which is available on Amazon, which talks about my journey. And each chapter is a different part of the brain. And it's really told through both science and story. And then people can reach out and have a conversation with my team who's here in Toronto, but they talk to people all around the world. Like our vision is to make this work accessible. As I say, we have online programs that people can access, and we put our work into schools around the world. But if there isn't a school near where that person lives, they can access our program online.
We will, of course, be linking to all of Barbara's offerings in the show notes as well. So be sure to check there on what all these offerings are that you can take part in and download and read. And also the books that she mentioned, you can use those as resources. And you can contact her team as well if you have questions or you'd like to work more closely with them. Definitely check the show notes for all of that information. And this has been another incredible episode, and I hope our listeners have enjoyed our journey into neuroplasticity and mental health as much as I have. It has been fantastic chatting with you this past half hour, Barbara, and thank you so much for all this wisdom that you brought to this episode. I thoroughly enjoyed myself and I learned so much, and I'm sure that we both actually probably stimulated our brains in this conversation and did some neuroplasticity for ourselves as well. Thank you so very much for coming on today and talking to us.
Yeah, well, and thank you, Petra, for allowing me to talk about what I'm passionate about, is the human brain.
Absolutely. What an important topic, and especially as we deal with so many stressors and negative things that are happening to us every day, so much importance placed on keeping our brains healthy and working with that. So I truly appreciate that you spoke with us today. Thank you so much, Barbara, and take care.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for taking time out of your day to listen in. If you enjoy the Journey podcast, please support us by subscribing, sharing on social media, and leaving us a review. We appreciate you. And you can find more of The Journey on Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, and our website, thejourney.com. Sending you love and courage, and see you next time.